Across oceans and continents, the story of countless Chinese families begins here in Taishan. In this quiet land, history does not shout. It breathes softly, through faded letters, warm photographs, and memories carried across the sea. Long before flights and instant messages, distance was measured in months, sometimes years. A single letter could be a lifeline. A few lines of ink could hold an entire family together. They left home with little more than a name, an address, and a promise. Some traveled to Southeast Asia, others crossed the Pacific to North America. Many would never return the way they imagined. Yet they built lives from the smallest beginnings. Railways and storefronts, kitchens and workshops, neighborhoods that became new homes. And with every step forward, they carried something backward: responsibility, longing, and love for the people waiting far away. Here, courage took its first step, and hope traveled further than anyone could have imagined. Today, the Taishan Overseas Chinese Culture Museum stands as a witness, not to one person's story, but to the shared story shaped by ordinary people who chose to endure. In this house, the past is not instant. It is personal. It is still alive. To understand why so many journeys began here, we must first understand Taishan itself. For centuries, Taishan stood at the edge of land and sea, a place shaped by geography, migrations, and survival. Mountains and water meet here. The land is fertile, yet limited. Life was stable, but opportunity was scarce. Generation after generation, people learned to look beyond the horizon. Not out of restlessness, but out of responsibility. Taishan became an early center of overseas migration, not because its people wished to live, but because they carried the weight of family and the hope of building a future beyond what the land alone could offer. This was not a place of departure alone. It was a place that raised religion, a quiet stream that would one day travel far beyond its shores. Long before modern borders and passports, the sea was already a network, connecting distant lands through trade, movement, and risk. Along the Mary Silk Road, coastal places like Taishan became part of a world in motion. Ships carry silk, ceramics, and tea. They also carry people, their languages, customs, and hopes. For Taishanese migrants, the ocean promised opportunity, but demanded courage. Journeys were long and uncertain. Months at sea, guided by tides and stars. Every departure carried the possibility of loss and the courage to continue. Some followed routes to Southeast Asia. Others crossed the Pacific to North America. What began as temporary travel slowly became settlement. Through trade came migration. Through migration came community. The sea did not only celebrate home from abroad, it became the bridge between who they were and who they would become. For many, leaving home was never a choice of adventure. It was a decision shaped by survival. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Taishan faced repeated hardship. Floods and droughts disrupted harvest. Land was limited, families were large, and opportunities were scarce. At the same time, news arrived from across the sea. Railways were being built. Mines and plantations demanded labor. Recruitment posters promised wages. While letters from earlier migrants spoke of possibility. Some went from South to Southeast Asia. Others crossed the Pacific, chasing what became known as Gold Mountain. The work was harsh. The conditions were dangerous. Yet for many, even the hardest labor abroad offered a chance to support those waiting at home. They did not live to seek fortune alone. they left to carry responsibility. And with every departure, a single decision reshaped not only one life, but generations to come. Overseas migrations was never a single experience. For Chinese migrants, the form of departure often determined the life that followed. Some left as contract laborers, bound by agreements they could rarely negotiate, recruited for mines, railways, and plantations. They labored under harsh conditions, with limited freedom and little protection. Others were known as so-called pilot laborers, men deceased or coerced into migrations, transported across the sea under brutal conditions. They were treated not as individuals, but as commodities. As Chinese communities grew abroad, fears and exclusions followed. In the late 19th century, restricted immigration laws reshaped migration itself. During the era of Chinese exclusion, entry was no longer determined by labor or intent, but by paperwork. Many Chinese migrants entered through what became known as paper identity, oral testimony, interrogation records, and carry memorized family histories became tools of survival. These documents, known as interrogation papers, were not simply records. They were evidence of lives lived under scrutiny, of identity questions, and of belonging constantly denied. Migration was no longer just a journey across oceans. It became a negotiation with power, law, and memory. Yet, even with these constraints, people endured, they adapted, and they found ways to remain. From a single place, the paths of Taishan's people spread across the world. What began as individual journeys slowly formed a global presence. Across Southeast Asia, Taiwanese communities took root. In port cities, trading hubs, and glowing towns, they worked as laborers, merchants, and craftsmen, building livelihoods far from home. Across the Pacific, they settled in North America. From the West Coast to inland cities, Taiwanese migrants became part of railways, mines, laundries, restaurants, and small business. Others reached to Australia, New Zealand, Europe, and parts of Latin America. Each destination carries its own challenges, its own limits, and its own possibilities. Though celebrated by oceans and borders, these communities remain connected through letters, remittances, dialect, and memory. On this map, we see not just places, but lives in motion, not just destinations, but generations shaped by movement. Wherever they settled, Taiwanese migrants became part of the places they entered. In the United States, they labor in fields and farms, helping to expand agricultural productions at a time when manpower was urgently needed. They cleared land, harvested crops, and sustained rural economies, often with little recognition and under difficult conditions. In glowing cities, they built livelihoods in service industries, laundries, small workshops, and family-run business became forms of survival, and over time, pillars of local communities. Across Central and South America, Chinese migrants contributed to agriculture, trade, and infrastructure. They adapted to unfamiliar climates and cultures, forging connections between continents. In Southeast Asia, they became deeply involved in commerce, manufacturing, and regional trade. Markets, ports, and urban economies were shaped by their labor and entrepreneurship. These contributions were rarely recorded in headlines. They appear instead in daily life, in food systems, supply chains, neighborhoods, and cities. Through quiet persistence, migrants help build the foundations of the societies they join. Among all that migrants carry across the sea, nothing traveled further or endured longer than their letters. Before phones, before recordings, words written by hand were the only bridge between departure and home. These letters spoke quietly. They carry news of survival, instructions for daily life, and reinsurance meant to ease worry. Money was often enclosed, but what truly matters were words, carefully chosen, sometimes restrained, often leaving hardship unspoken. Pain was rarely written down. Loneliness was hidden between lines. Hope, however, was always present. For families waiting at home, each letter was proof of life, a reminder that distance had not erased connection. Today, these letters rest behind glass. Their ink was faded, their paper grew fragile. Yet the emotions they carried remain instant. They remind us that migrant was never only about movement or labor, but about love, responsibility, and the quiet determination to remain connected, no matter how far the sea. For overseas Chinese, a passport was never just a document. It was a proof of identity, and sometimes the only permissions to exist. Stamped and numbered, it decided where one could go and whether one could stay. Behind each page was a life negotiating borders, flaws, and belonging. Wherever Chinese migrants settled, they built more than livelihoods. They built communities. Chinatowns emerged as a place of refuge where language was familiar, food tasted like home, and traditions could survive far from their origins. Within these neighborhoods, associations were formed, clean groups, hometown societies, and mutual aid organizations offer protection, support, and a sense of belonging in unfamiliar lands. Chinese language newspapers follow. They carry news from home, share information about daily life abroad, and gave voice to a community often unheard. Schools were established. Children learned to read and write Chinese, to remember their roots, even as they grew up speaking another language. Festivals were celebrated, ancestral ties were honored, values were passed quietly from one generation to the next. These streets were not closed to worlds. They were bridges connecting heritage with the societies around them. Through Chinatowns and overseas communities, Chinese culture did not disappear. It adopted, it endured. As life slowly took root abroad, many overseas Chinese never forgot where they came from. Across oceans, their support returned home not only through remittances, but through education. Schools were built with donation funds, classrooms, libraries, and scholarships became bridges between generations. For many migrants, education represented what they themselves had been denied and what they hoped to secure for those who follow. These schools were not symbols of wealth, they were acts of responsibility. Through education, overseas Chinese invested not only in buildings, but in futures. Long after individual journeys ended, the knowledge they helped cultivate continued to grow. Traditional homes in Taishan were shaped by both environment and values. Built for large families, these houses emphasize order, balance, and practicality. Central halls serve as shared space for meals, gatherings, and ancestral rituals. Private rooms were modest, reflecting a way of life centered on restraint rather than display. Thick walls, narrow windows, and inner courtyards help regulate light, airflow, and temperature in the subtropical climate. Every detail carried meaning. Architecture was not about shelter, but about family structure, respect for elders, and the rhythm of daily life. Within these interiors, traditions was lived, not spoken. Taishan is a coastal city in southern China, located in Guangdong province, where mountains meet the sea. For generations, this land have lived between staying and living. It was here that countless journeys began, quiet departures shaped by responsibility, hope, and the proof of distant horizons. Yet, Taishan is not only defined by those who left. Today, the city carries both memory and change. Historic village stands beside expanding urban districts. Old family homes share the landscape with new roads, schools, and industries. Daily life has been reshaped by modern infrastructure, education, and renewed local development. At the same time, traditions remain embedded in agriculture, customs, and community life. Overseas connections continue to flow back to this place through culture, investment, and exchange. Taishan's story is no longer only about departure, it is also about continuity, renewal, and a future shaped through dialogue with the world.
Nations have excelled and hold high positions in technology, business, science, academia, and government. As Conrad said, I was the first Asian American governor on the mainland, first Chinese American governor in U.S. history. But we also have many Asian American elected officials, Bob Hasegawa, Janice, and of course, Bruce Harrell. Bruce Harrell is part Asian American. His mom was Japanese. Yet the Asian community, and especially ethnic Chinese, have been targets of violence here in Seattle's Chinatown and all across the United States. And it really began during COVID, when the president blamed China and the Chinese people for COVID. Let me just stop a minute and talk about Chinatown. We all know that Chinatown has not been a safe place to go to. We all know that there's a lot of crime, drug dealing, homeless who beg and pander and disrupt and really accost the people of Chinatown, the visitors, especially our senior citizens. Thanks to Mayor Bruce Harrell, Seattle Police Department and the Human Service agencies are finally doing something about it, and Chinatown is better than it has been before. Thank you, Mayor Bruce Harrell. But sadly, throughout America, ethnic Chinese are targets of laws and policies based on the belief that we are not true and loyal Americans. What has caused this dramatic change?
The journeys that began in places like Taishan did not end with migration. They continue into community life, public service, and the conversations that shape modern society. Today, in Seattle, those histories find new expression. As Gary Locke speaks, his words carry more than personal experience. They reflect generations shaped by movement, by perseverance, by the enduring questions of belonging. This moment is not celebrated from the past. It is the part of the same story, one that began with departure and continued through participation. Here, history does not remain behind glass. It continues.
The reason you should know about this 1898 Supreme Court ruling is it because it involved a Chinese person whose parents could not become U.S. citizens even though the child was born in America. It was a time similar to today's undocumented immigrants. It was a time when most Chinese were not allowed to come to the United States, and the few who did come to the United States were not allowed to become U.S. citizens, hostile to ethnic Chinese and Chinese Americans. Florida and Texas have recently passed laws that say that ethnic Chinese cannot own a house or commercial property unless they are a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident. Unless you are a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, you cannot buy a house in Texas or Florida. And many other states are considering doing exactly the same thing. That is why all Asian Americans and Chinese Americans must know what is going on.
The story of Taishan is not confined to one place or one generation. It lives in journeys taken, in homes built and left waiting, in letters written, and in voices that continue to shape the present. From a coastal hometown to cities across the world, the history is not finished. It is carried forward by memory, by participation, and by those who choose to remain connected. Here, history is not something we observe. It is something we take part in.